Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be doing the APush pages 11 through 24 podcast, and so I guess we'll just start right up. Not no time to really waste. So this is page 11 through 24. So obviously the Vikings were there before Columbus, right? Leif Erikson made landfall in a place he called Vinland, and that's what we call the New World, Americas. But they didn't really have an impact, so it really took till the Spanish to have a real impact on the New World, right? So Europeans entered Africa, basically began with Marco Polo, right? And for example, under Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese started this, and they looked out for gold, spices, Christian allies. They wanted to reach India by sea, and they established many ports alongside the coast of Africa. They believed, they also believed in Prester John, which was a legendary Christian king set to rule a kingdom in Africa or Asia. And he thought he was a Christian ally that was very wealthy and that was beyond the Muslim world. So Africa was basically viewed as a map of resources and fables, right? That's how colonization begins. It wasn't with war, but it was slowly with trade and cultural things. And they inserted a new commodity, and they started renaming things. And yeah, so Columbus, right? So Columbus was basically the explorer. So he obviously explored lands beyond the Mediterranean, and Africa had already been established as a place of cheap slave labor for plantation agriculture. And the Portuguese voyages had displayed sort of that it's not just possible, but viable, right? Um, so Christopher Columbus eventually managed to persuade the Spanish to give him three tiny little ships, and he managed to sail west, and he discovered America. He thought he'd actually reached the East Indies, and that's what you call uh, Indonesia, whatever. But he actually founded the Americas. And what followed wasn't just really conquest, it was violence. Languages died, gods were silenced, even time was rewritten, calendars replaced, and Spanish began. And they to the Native Americans, they just completely got overridden, partially due to the fact that culturally the Europeans were superior militarily, but also they had um, they were militarily superior, but also they had disease. They were more resistant to diseases. So the Columbian Exchange was basically what called uh, that echoed for after 1492 is where there's an exchange of resources between the New World and the Old World, right? So, for example, European really like to see iguanas, rattlesnakes, and New World plants such as tobacco, especially tobacco, maize, beans, tomatoes, especially potatoes, which really helped the Europeans because the potatoes are very, very important for the diet because they're easily available. They have a lot of carbs. They provide a lot of food. And of course, the Europeans brought in horses, livestock, cattle. So they slowly traded and they brought it to the Apache tribes. And they kept coming after, and they also brought sugarcane, which was really, really able to thrive. And they were able to form a lot of um, a lot of plantations, right? Okay, Hernan Cortez. He landed in 1519, right? So Spain basically secured its claim in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically divided Portugal, basically saying, okay, everything west of this line, we get. Everything east, you guys can have. And that treaty basically is that allowed Portugal to get Africa, but Spain to get the New World. So the Spanish conquistadors fanned out. So Hernan Cortez, let's go back to him. He marched into Tenochtitlan, a really complex city and probably the most a marvel of architecture, astronomy, and political choreography. And he brought steel, guns, germs. Guns, steel, and guns, steel, and horses. And even if he couldn't have defeated the Aztecs militarily, which he might have been able to, but he had such a small army that he probably couldn't have. But smallpox did what swords could not. So it's kind of just unfortunate that it was Spanish tore down temples and built churches. But yeah, that's what happened. And Francisco Pizarro in 1532 crushed the Incas and took all the gold and silver they had. And by 1600, Spain had so much New World silver, and Bolivia and Mexico, and they were selling these in Europe. And this is This fueled capitalism. So this transformed the New World economy. And just a little side talk here: Christianity and things. So this was one of the main three motivators: God, gold, and glory, as you guys can see. So God, gold, and glory, right? But God was one of the biggest ones. And for example, the encomienda system basically granted the Spanish settlers a right to the indigenous labor, as long as they were converted. So the purposes of religion tied into economic purposes to sort of be better for the society that furthered this goal. Um, so every colonial power eventually wrapped itself in divine language. Britain, for example, to conquer in the name of God was to sanctify violence. And obviously, this is a big question: can universalism coexist with power? Christianity does claim to be for all souls, but when backed by an empire, often operated as a tool of domination, like the encomienda system. But okay, so obviously Hernan Cortez also heard of the City of Gold, but soon the Native Americans were pretty much wiped out by disease or very minor, and the Spanish ruled vast stretches of Americas, from Mexico to Peru to Ecuador to Guatemala. Those complete areas Spanish had control. And silver was one of the most important things, as you guys talked. But resistance, indigenous traditions didn't 100% disappear, but they instead kind of adapted. So Christianity in, for example, the Andes sort of fused with the fused with fused with Christianity and the pre-existing traditions to sort of form a sort of syncretism of a kind, uh, as religions combined. And hundreds of Spanish cities were there. And in 1860, there was the missionaries' efforts to really suppress the native religions. In 1860, there was this Indian uprising called the Pope's Rebellion. Um, and before that, in 1599, the Battle of Oklahoma, they brutally abused native peoples. And in 1680, they finally rebelled, and they destroyed every single Catholic church in the province and killed tons of priests and hundreds of Spanish settlers. So you know how the Spanish tore down temples and built churches, right? The Indians tore down churches uh, and built built a temple. But it took half a century, and the Spanish fully reclaimed that land. They fought very, very hard. And the French, by this time, had already reached the Mississippi. If you've heard of New Orleans, you can obviously see the French influence in New Orleans. There are many. The language the people speak there is often a Creole combination of French and English and African traditions. Um, so to do that, some of the refugees from the from the Pueblo uprising trickled into Texas, and a few missions were actually established there. But for many centuries after that, the Spanish presence was really weak here, and this was sort of an area where Pueblos could go to practice their religion. California was focused by the Spanish, and Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo had explored the California coast in 1542, but he failed to find San Francisco Bay or anything of interest. California was basically undisturbed by European influence. And then in 1769, Spanish missionaries, led by Father Junipero Serra, landed at San Diego, and at a first of 21 missions, they managed to map out the entire coast. So when Spain built its America, right, the Atlantic slave trade became central, right? Africans were taken, shipped, sold, not just as labor, but more as a part of a system that that was not only economic but also social. The Europeans started to believe they were superior to Africans genetically, and this is the rise of social Darwinism. And in 19th century, obviously, there was no scramble for Africa, where Europeans served to colonize all Africa, but that's a little bit later. But some of you might recognize that. But this is sort of the end of our thing. The Black Legend was that the Spanish just destroyed everything that was in their path. That was what's called the Black Legend. The book here argues that they grafted their culture, they erected colossal empires, and the Spanish were genuine emperors builders, and that is true to all they say. But there is a little bit of a debate here. Like, how justified do you think the Spanish were, and how good do you think the Spanish are? How do you perceive the Spanish invasion? That's a very very important question. When it comes to discussing the thing, and I don't know if we're allowed to do this verbally, but I'm gonna do it verbally. So, it asks, "What surprised you the most and why?" And that's a good question, right? That's a reflection question. What surprised me the most? I'd have to say what surprised me the most was the uprising of the Native Americans, because when we go over it, at least in younger grades, we sort of glaze over the fact that the Native Americans, so we act like they got completely dominated. They didn't resist. They couldn't resist. They were unable to. But in reality, it was more like they tried. They fought very very valiantly for their values, but they were unfortunately quelled. And which part connects to your own life? I think in a way we can relate to the Indians there. You know, they they were probably when faced with the Europeans, they were faced with this very powerful force, and many people would have just given up, but they chose to fight, and we can speculate on why. Why did they choose to fight when it seems so hopeless? And I think that's pretty inspirational. You should fight when it seems hopeless. Maybe meaning isn't given, but the fight, that's how you derive meaning. That's at least my interpretation. Um, so yeah, I think I'm probably gonna end the stream there. Yeah, see you guys.